Hello, dear listeners. Have you ever wondered, was history made only by men, while women merely watched quietly from behind? Or perhaps, did the women in the Bible only play supporting roles, simply helping the men? If you've been thinking this way, today's session will offer you a completely new perspective. The Bible contains stories of numerous great women who led God's history, and even today, such women continue to change the world around us. The journey we'll explore together today is not simply about listening to stories of the past. It will be a time to compare the great women of the Bible with excellent women of modern times, discovering God's hand that transcends time. Most importantly, we'll contemplate what meaning and challenges each of you can find in your own lives. Psychologist Carl Jung spoke of the concept of collective unconscious and archetypal images that humanity commonly shares. Among these, the wise woman, or mother archetype, was said to be a powerful symbol that penetrates all cultures and ages. Interestingly, the stories of biblical women go beyond these archetypes to show more concrete and practical aspects of life. Sociologist Pierre Bourdieu explained through his concept of habitus how individual actions interact with social structures. The women in the Bible, even within the constraints of the patriarchal social structures of their time, responded to God's calling and created new possibilities that transcended existing frameworks. This principle applies equally to women today. So what questions should we begin this journey with? First, how were biblical women able to transcend the limitations of their times? Second, what commonalities do excellent modern women share with biblical women? Third, what practical lessons can we learn from their lives? With these questions in our hearts, let us now move into each chapter. Chapter 1. Deborah and Angela Merkel, The Power of Wise Leadership. Research on leadership has become active relatively recently. Professor John Cotter of Harvard Business School explains the difference between leadership and management. Management is for maintaining the status quo, while leadership is about leading change. From this perspective, Deborah in the Bible already demonstrated what true leadership was 3,000 years ago. Let's examine Deborah's story once more. Recorded in Judges chapters 4 and 5, Israel was under the oppression of the Canaanites at that time. Deborah appeared before the people who had been suffering for 20 long years. But there's something important to note here. Deborah was not simply a military leader. The Bible introduces her as Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, while simultaneously recording that she judged Israel. In other words, she was both a spiritual leader and a political leader. Women's studies researchers often discuss the glass ceiling phenomenon, the concept that women can advance to a certain level within organizations, but face invisible barriers to the highest positions. However, Deborah had already shattered such glass ceilings 3,000 years ago. The dialogue that occurred when Deborah commanded Barak to go to war is truly fascinating. When Barak said, "If you go with me, I will go. If you don't go with me, I will not go," Deborah responded, "I will surely go with you." But she also added, "Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory." Here we can discover the characteristics of true leadership. Deborah did not assert her authority. Rather, she lifted up others and helped them succeed. We can see in her the servant leadership that modern leadership theory speaks of. Now let's move to the story of Germany's former Chancellor Angela Merkel. Merkel led Germany for 16 years from 2005 to 2021 and was called the de facto leader of Europe, having great influence on world politics. Political scientist Joseph Nye presented the concept of soft power, the power to influence other countries not through hard power like military or economic force, but through cultural appeal, values, and legitimacy. Merkel's leadership is a typical example of such soft power. When the global financial crisis occurred in 2008, many countries turned to protectionism. However, Merkel overcame the crisis while maintaining European Union solidarity. The same was true during the 2015 refugee crisis. Her words, "We can do this," gave hope not only to Germany, but to all of Europe. Interestingly, Merkel did not lead people through flashy speeches or charisma. Rather, she built trust through a quiet and careful approach. This has very similar aspects to Deborah's leadership. Psychologist Daniel Goleman emphasized the importance of emotional intelligence. The ability to manage one's own emotions well, understand others' emotions, and build relationships well is the core of true leadership. Both Deborah and Merkel were people with excellent emotional intelligence. But there's another point we need to think about more deeply. What was the source of Deborah's leadership? The Bible answers clearly. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Deborah. In other words, her wisdom, judgment, and courage came from God. When analyzing Merkel's leadership in modern secular society, the focus is mainly on her personal abilities or political techniques. However, Merkel herself has a Christian background as a pastor's daughter, and her values and judgment standards are deeply infused with a Christian worldview. This poses an important question for us. What is the true source of leadership? Isn't there a limit to individual abilities or experience alone? Looking at the cases of Deborah and Merkel, we can see that true leadership is manifested when one is devoted to values and purposes greater than oneself. But there's also a point we should think about critically. Does gender really matter in leadership? Aren't we perhaps trapped in the framework of women's leadership and missing the essential principles of leadership? Actually, the reason Deborah and Merkel's leadership is special is not because they were women. It's because they were faithful to their assigned roles and devoted themselves to the benefit of their communities. They demonstrated the principles of true leadership that transcend gender. From a biblical perspective, God calls people to fulfill His purposes regardless of gender, age, or social status. Deborah was chosen not because she was a woman, but because she was ready to respond to God's calling. This principle applies equally to us today. In whatever position we stand, whether at home, at work, or in the community, we can exercise leadership that serves and builds up others with the wisdom and ability God has given us. So how can we practice this concretely? First, we must practice listening leadership. Deborah listened to the people's stories under the palm of Deborah. Merkel was also famous for listening to various opinions and making careful decisions. Second, we must exercise leadership that builds up others. Deborah built up Barak, and Merkel cooperated with other European leaders. Third, we must practice principle-based leadership, making decisions and acting according to right values and principles, not popularity or personal gain. Where are you exercising leadership now? Do you perhaps think that leadership is only for special people? The stories of Deborah and Merkel tell us this. True leadership comes not from position or power, but from a heart of service and faith toward God. Chapter 2. Esther and Malala Yousafzai. The Power of Courageous Voices. Philosophical reflection on courage dates back to Aristotle. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he defined courage as the mean between fear and confidence. In other words, true courage is acting at the right time for the right cause, being neither reckless nor cowardly. Modern psychologist Brené Brown said this about courage. Courage is what emerges despite uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. From this perspective, the stories of Esther and Malala Yousafzai are perfect examples showing what true courage is. Esther's story unfolds within the enormous power structure of the Persian Empire. Persia at that time was a superpower, ruling 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In the center of that empire, in the palace of Susa, a young Jewish woman changed the fate of her people. Let's think more specifically about Esther's situation. She was an orphan from a minority ethnic group raised in a foreign land. Although she became queen, she was actually nothing more than the king's property. According to Persian law at that time, anyone who came before the king without being summoned could be put to death. In this absolutely disadvantageous situation, what characteristics did Esther's courage have? First, her courage was prepared courage. She said, "I and my maids will fast for 3 days, and you do the same." It wasn't an impulsive emotional decision, but one prepared through seeking God's will through prayer and fasting. Second, her courage was wise courage. When she came before the king, she didn't immediately speak of the Jews' crisis. She first held a banquet to put the king and Haman at ease, then spoke the core message at the appropriate timing. Third, her courage was sacrificial courage. She acted with the resolution, "If I perish, I perish." She didn't think first of her own safety or benefit, but offered herself for the survival of her people. Now moving to modern times, let's look at Malala Yousafzai's story. On October 9th, 2012, a 15-year-old girl was shot by the Taliban on a school bus in Pakistan. The reason was simple. She had said that women also have the right to education. The Swat region where Malala grew up was under strong Taliban control. From 2007, the Taliban seized control of this region and banned women's education. Over 400 girls' schools were closed, and countless girls had to give up their dreams. In this situation, 11-year-old Malala began writing a blog for BBC Urdu service. Although she used a pseudonym, it was writing that criticized the Taliban's education ban policy and promoted the importance of women's education. How dangerous was this? Human rights scholar Martha Nussbaum emphasized the importance of the right to education in her book, Women and Human Development. Education is not simply acquiring knowledge, but a basic right to realize human dignity and achieve one's potential. Malala fought for exactly this basic human right, risking her life. The commonalities between Malala and Esther are truly remarkable. First, both confronted enormous power structures at a young age. Esther faced the Persian Empire, the ancient world's strongest power, while Malala showed courage before the Taliban, who had seized control of the region with force. Second, both sacrificed for communities greater than themselves. Esther for the Jewish people, Malala for Pakistani and global girls. Both gave up their safety. Third, both turned desperate situations into hope. Through Esther, the Jewish people were saved, and through Malala, the whole world was reminded of the importance of women's education. But there's also a point we should think about critically. Can social structural problems really be solved by individual courage alone? While the courage of Esther or Malala is certainly great, not everything changed through their individual strength alone. Looking at Esther's case, there was Mordecai as an advisor, and the prayers and fasting of the Jewish community supported her. There was also God's providential intervention, the king's inability to sleep leading him to read the history books and remember Mordecai's contribution, Haman's plan to kill Mordecai on the very day he was instead honored. These were not mere coincidences. Malala's case is similar. Her father, Ziauddin Yousafzai, was an educator and human rights activist, and there was international attention and support. Also, the power of modern media enabled her message to reach the whole world. This teaches us an important lesson. Individual courage is certainly important, but it has limitations alone. When community support, appropriate timing, and above all, God's help come together, true change occurs. From a biblical perspective, the fundamental source of courage is faith in God. Although God's name is not directly mentioned in the book of Esther, God's providence and protection are revealed throughout the story. Esther's courage came not from confidence in her own abilities, but from faith that God would work through her. So how can we practice this? First, we must start with small things. Rather than dreaming of grand heroic actions, we should begin with small acts of courage that we can do now. Second, we must remember we're not alone. Just as Esther had Mordecai in the Jewish community, we too have people who will stand with us. Third, we must seek God's will. Rather than acting simply according to our opinions or emotions, we must discern what direction God wants through prayer. Fourth, we must act wisely. We need the wisdom to wait for the right time and choose the right method, like Esther did. Where do you feel you need courage now? Are you perhaps giving up because the task seems too big and difficult? The stories of Esther and Malala tell us this. Courage is not the absence of fear, but choosing to do what's right despite fear. Chapter 3. Ruth and Comfort Women Survivors. Loyalty Rising from Wounds. Trauma research pioneer Judith Herman said, "Recovery from trauma has political and social meaning beyond the personal dimension. The rising again of wounded individuals is itself resistance against an unjust world." From this perspective, Ruth's story and the lives of Comfort Women survivors carry deep meaning that transcends mere personal history. The book of Ruth is considered one of the most beautiful love stories in the Bible. But if we look closely at its background, it's filled with desperate situations. Having to leave home due to famine, and Naomi losing her husband and both sons in a foreign land, was the worst scenario a woman could face in that society. In ancient Near Eastern society, women's social status was defined only through relationships with men, as father's daughter, husband's wife, mother's son. Naomi had lost all these relationships. Moreover, she was a widow in a foreign land with no social safety net at all. Anthropologist Clifford Geertz described culture as a web of meaning. People find meaning in life within the context of their culture. Ruth's choice was to transcend exactly this kind of cultural boundary. She decided to leave the Moabite culture, where she was born and raised, and accept Israeli culture and faith. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. This famous confession contains not just human affection, but a deep spiritual decision that transcends it. Analyzing Ruth's choice from a modern perspective makes it even more remarkable. Women at that time had almost no choice. Especially for widowed women, it was common to return to their parents' home or marry the deceased husband's relatives through levirate marriage. But Ruth didn't follow these social conventions and chose her own path. From the perspective of Pierre Bourdieu's concept of habitus, Ruth was a person who transcended the social structures and customs she inherited to create new possibilities. Despite all disadvantages, her Moabite background, widow status, foreigner limitations, she turned these constraints into new opportunities. Now let's move to the stories of modern Comfort Women survivors. The pain these women experienced is indescribably deep and complex. Forcibly taken in their youth and deprived of all rights they should naturally have enjoyed as humans, they had to face society's prejudice and discrimination, even after liberation. Trauma specialist Bessel van der Kolk said, "Trauma is recorded in the body. Terrible experiences don't simply remain as past memories, but leave deep wounds throughout the body and mind." What Comfort Women victims experienced was exactly this kind of total personality damage. But what's amazing is that even in such desperate situations, many didn't give up. Starting with Kim Hak-soon's first public testimony, about her victimization in 1991, countless survivors began breaking their silence and raising their voices. The characteristics of the courage these women showed are remarkably similar to Ruth's loyalty. First, they sublimated personal pain into community healing. Just as Ruth transformed her suffering into devotion to Naomi, Comfort Women survivors transformed their wounds into testimony, revealing historical truth. Second, they didn't abandon hope, even in desperate situations. Just as Ruth vowed to stay together until death, survivors continue working to reveal the truth until the end of their lives. Third, they thought of future generations rather than themselves. Just as Ruth tried to continue Naomi's family line, survivors convey the message, "Don't forget history," and "This must never happen again," to future generations. But there's a point we must carefully consider. Is it right to demand that suffering people meaningfully sublimate that suffering? Aren't we perhaps placing another burden on victims? Viktor Frankl, based on his experience in Nazi concentration camps, said, "Suffering itself has no meaning, but we can choose our attitude towards suffering." However, he also emphasized that suffering should neither be glorified, nor should unnecessary suffering be endured. Looking at Ruth's case, her loyalty was ultimately rewarded. She married Boaz and gained the honor of becoming an ancestor of King David's lineage. But not all suffering ends in such happy endings. Many Comfort Women survivors passed away without seeing honor restored. So how should we understand this reality? From a biblical perspective, God's justice occurs on a larger dimension that cannot be fully grasped by our limited vision. What we see immediately is not everything. Looking at the end of Ruth, there's an interesting expression. Naomi's relatives said, "A son has been born to Naomi," and they named the child Obed. Though Ruth gave birth to the son, people called him Naomi's son. This means Ruth's sacrifice led to Naomi's restoration. Similarly, the testimony and struggle of Comfort Women survivors went beyond themselves to raise human rights awareness throughout our society and awaken us to the preciousness of peace. Personal wounds became community healing. So how can we apply these principles in daily life? First, we must look to see if there are people around us who are hurt and struggling. Just as Ruth didn't ignore Naomi's pain, we must not be indifferent to others' suffering. Also, we shouldn't simply be ashamed of difficulties or failures we've experienced, but accept them as precious assets that can help others. Most importantly, we must view our lives from God's perspective. Even suffering that we can't understand right now, God is working through it to accomplish greater good, and we must have this faith. Where are you living with wounds or difficulties now? Are you perhaps cutting off relationships with others because of that pain? The stories of Ruth and Comfort Women survivors tell us this. Wounds can become pathways leading us to deeper love and devotion. Chapter 4. Mary and Kate Middleton. The beauty of humble obedience. Philosophical discussion of obedience is very complex. Immanuel Kant emphasized moral autonomy, speaking of the importance of reason-based judgment rather than blind obedience. In contrast, Kierkegaard used Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac as an example, saying that sometimes a leap of faith beyond reason is necessary. Mary's obedience was exactly this kind of leap of faith. Let's specifically imagine Mary's situation when she received the angel Gabriel's message. She was probably about 14 to 16 years old at the time, an ordinary maiden engaged to the carpenter Joseph in the small town of Nazareth. To her came the news that, "You will conceive and give birth to the Son of God." What did it mean for a virgin to have a child in Jewish society at that time? According to Deuteronomy 22, if an engaged virgin had relations with another man, the law was to stone her to death. Mary would have been fully aware of this danger. Sociologist Georg Simmel in his sociological analysis of secrets, explained the psychological burden of knowing important information alone. Mary, too, after receiving the angel's message, was in a situation where she couldn't easily tell anyone about that amazing fact. Who would believe her? But Mary's response is surprising. I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled. What meaning is contained in these words? First, her obedience was not blind. She asked, how will this be, since I am a virgin? This wasn't simple doubt, but a reasonable question trying to understand the situation. Second, her obedience was active. Saying, may your word be fulfilled, wasn't a passive attitude of simply accepting, but an expression of will to actively participate in God's plan. Third, her obedience was total. It wasn't simply agreeing in her heart, but offering her entire body and life to God. According to psychologist Erik Erikson's developmental stage theory, adolescence is a time of identity versus role confusion, a time of worrying about who one is and what kind of life one should live. Mary, who would have been at exactly that stage, clearly found her identity through God's calling. Now, let's move to the story of modern Kate Middleton. Becoming the Duchess of Cambridge after marrying Prince William in 2011, she's presenting a new model for 21st century royalty. Actually, the role of modern royalty is very delicate. While having no political power, symbolic meaning remains important, and they must maintain tradition while adapting to changing times. Especially maintaining dignity while having even private life exposed under strong media attention is never easy. Looking at what Kate has shown, we can discover characteristics similar to Mary's obedience. First, she's faithful to her assigned role. Rather than pursuing flashy personal fame, she focuses on what she should do as a member of the royal family. She develops her own areas of expertise like child development, mental health, and photography, while harmonizing with the royal family's traditional values. Second, she pursues a family-centered life. Her attention to home education as a mother of 3 children resembles the maternal devotion Mary showed as Jesus' mother. Third, she maintains a humble attitude. She doesn't take for granted the attention or privileges she receives, and always expresses gratitude. But there's a point we should think about critically. Is obedience always good? What if the object or command requiring obedience is wrong? Looking at history, we can easily find tragic results brought by blind obedience. The Holocaust in Nazi Germany, purges in Stalin's era, Japan's imperial invasions, all were carried out under the pretext of obedience to orders. So how was Mary's obedience different? The key lies in the object and purpose of obedience. What Mary obeyed was not human authority but God's will, and its purpose was a plan of love to save the world. Also, Mary's obedience wasn't forced, but a voluntary choice. The angel didn't threaten or forcibly impregnate her, but asked for Mary's consent, and Mary answered yes with free will. This is a core characteristic of biblical obedience. God didn't create humans as robots or puppets, but as beings with free will. Therefore, true obedience is a total personal decision, involving reason, emotion, and will. What about Kate Middleton's case? Her conformity to the royal family might sometimes seem to suppress individuality, but her choice was also voluntary. Both marrying Prince William and becoming a member of the royal family were her own decisions. More importantly, she's not blindly following royal traditions, but reinterpreting them in her own way. For example, in child rearing, she's attempting modern and natural approaches different from existing royal traditions. From a feminist perspective, the concept of obedience itself might be problematic. Historically, obedience has been imposed on women as a virtue and used as a tool to suppress women's autonomy and abilities. But looking at Mary's case, her obedience wasn't passive submission, but active participation. She took on a core role in God's salvation plan and actually became the agent who changed history. This can be called a case where true self-realization was achieved through obedience. How can we redefine the meaning of obedience in modern situations? First, we must discern the object of obedience. Rather than unconditionally obeying all authority, we must judge whether it's truly worth obeying. Second, we must consider the purpose of obedience, whether that obedience will ultimately bring good results and benefit ourselves and our community. Third, we must choose the manner of obedience, pursuing wise and active obedience rather than blind and passive obedience. So how can we apply these principles in daily life? At home, we must find balance between mutual obedience and respect. Rather than demanding unilateral obedience in marital relationships, we need an attitude of mutual respect and seeking God's will together. At work, even if it's a superior's order, we must deal wisely with ethically problematic situations. Rather than unconditional compliance, presenting constructive alternatives shows true responsibility. In religious life, obedience to God's word shouldn't stop at formal rule following. Understanding the spirit of the word and wisely applying it to reality is important. To whom, to what are you being obedient now? Is that obedience making you a more mature and free person, or a withdrawn and passive person? The stories of Mary and Kate tell us this. True obedience is not giving up the self, but investing the self for a greater purpose. Chapter 5. Hannah and Mothers of Prayer, Planting Seeds with Tears of Prayer. Research on prayer is actively conducted not only in religious studies, but also in psychology and neuroscience. Dr. Herbert Benson of Harvard Medical School scientifically proved prayer and meditation's positive effects on the human body. Stress hormones decrease, immunity improves, and blood pressure lowers. However, Hannah's prayer is a story of spiritual dimensions far beyond such scientific effects. Let's look closely at Hannah's situation. The story recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 1 was during a spiritually very dark time for Israel. It was recorded that the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. Priest Eli's sons ignored God and were corrupt, and the people were also spiritually fallen. In this situation, Hannah's personal pain would have been even deeper. Infertility was an indelible shame for women at that time. Moreover, Peninnah, Elkanah's other wife, had many sons and daughters and provoked Hannah. This agony was repeated every year when they went up to Shiloh to offer sacrifices. Anthropologist René Girard explained human conflict through mimetic desire theory. People see what others have and want it, which creates envy, jealousy, and conflict. The relationship between Hannah and Peninnah is also a typical case of such mimetic desire. But Hannah's chosen solution is surprising. Instead of competing with Peninnah or complaining to her husband, she came to God. More surprising is the content of her prayer. She didn't simply ask for a son, but vowed, "If you give me a son, I will give him to God." According to psychologist Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people pursue higher-level needs only after satisfying basic needs. But Hannah's case transcends this general pattern. She offered her urgent personal need for God's glory. Hannah's prayer method is also noteworthy. In her deep anguish, her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. It was such earnest and desperate prayer that priest Eli mistook her for being drunk. This was completely different from formal and ceremonial prayer. Psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott presented the concept of good enough mother, not a perfect mother, but one who sensitively recognizes and appropriately responds to the child's needs is important for the child's healthy development. Hannah was exactly this kind of mother. Even after bearing Samuel, she carefully cared for him until weaning, and after dedicating him to the temple, she continued to make little robes for him each year. Now let's move to the stories of modern praying mothers. The situation of North Korea's underground churches is very similar to Israel in Hannah's time. Religious freedom is thoroughly suppressed, and if prayer or worship is discovered, one can be dragged to political prison camps or executed. Even in such extreme situations, North Korean underground church believers, especially mothers, don't stop praying. According to defectors' testimonies, they pray silently under blankets in the deep night and secretly gather in mountains or remote places to pray. From the perspective of James C. Scott's Everyday Resistance in Domination and the Arts of Resistance, such prayer has political meaning beyond simple religious acts. It's spiritual resistance against an oppressive system. Korean praying mothers can also be understood in a similar context. During the democratization movement period of the 1970s to 80s, many mothers prayed with tears for their imprisoned children and for the country's democratization. Prayer meetings held at Myeongdong Cathedral and local churches were not simple religious events, but spiritual movements for social change. Even now, praying mothers continue. There are mothers praying for children suffering from school violence, for children exhausted by entrance exam competition, for young people wandering due to employment difficulties. But there's a point we should think about critically. Does prayer really help solve realistic problems? Isn't prayer perhaps just a means of escapism? Philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach criticized religion as human projection, passing problems that cannot be solved in reality to God. Karl Marx also expressed religion as opium of the people, criticizing its role in numbing the pain of reality. How can we answer such criticism? Looking at Hannah's case, we discover an interesting point. Her prayer led not to escapism, but to reality participation. She received a son but offered that son to God, resulting in the birth of the great prophet Samuel. Personal prayer led to national historical change. According to neuroscientist Andrew Newberg's research, when praying or meditating, the brain's frontal cortex is activated. This area is related to planning, problem-solving, and decision-making. In other words, prayer is not simple wish expression, but activity that activates the brain's creative thinking. Social psychologist Kenneth Pargament, through religious coping research, proved that prayer and faith provide substantial help in stressful situations. It doesn't just give psychological comfort, but provides practical motivation and energy for problem solving. Why was Hannah's prayer special? First, her prayer was honest. She didn't hide her pain and despair from God, but poured them out as they were. She didn't package them with fake piety. Second, her prayer was specific. She didn't vaguely say, "Bless me," but had clear content. "Give me a son, and I will offer him to God." Third, her prayer was devotional. It wasn't just about receiving, but included a vow to give something herself. Fourth, her prayer was persistent. She didn't pray once and finish, but continued pleading with God every year as she went up to Shiloh. Modern praying mothers also show these characteristics. The prayers of North Korean underground church believers are honest, risking their lives. The prayers Korean mothers offer for their children are also specific and devotional. But there's another point to think about more deeply. Hannah received a son, but not all prayers are answered as desired. There are mothers who prayed for family members' release in North Korea, but passed away without meeting them, and cases where children weren't healed, despite prayers for their health. How should we understand such situations? From a biblical perspective, the purpose of prayer is not simply to fulfill our wishes. It's a process of deepening our relationship with God and aligning our hearts with God's will. Philosopher Simone Weil said, Prayer is not us demanding something from God, but listening to what God demands from us. Hannah's prayer can also be understood in this dimension. She asked for a son, but in the process discovered what God's will was and found her role. Modern praying mothers are the same. Even if they don't receive immediately visible answers, their prayers aren't in vain. Through praying, they come to embrace God's heart, understand others' pain, and gain courage and wisdom to change reality. So how can we practice this? First, we must pray honestly. There's no need to wear masks before God. We can honestly pour out even the dark parts of our hearts. Second, we must pray specifically. Rather than asking for vague blessings, we should pray about specific situations and needs. Third, we must pray devotionally. Don't just try to receive, but also think about what I can offer. Fourth, we must pray persistently. Don't pray once or twice and give up, but pray steadily until receiving answers. What are you praying for now? Is your prayer perhaps degenerating into mere wish-making? The stories of Hannah and praying mothers tell us this. True prayer is not moving God's heart, but our hearts being moved toward God. Chapter 6. Mary Magdalene and Oprah Winfrey. Transformation from despair to hope. Psychological research on change and recovery is very rich. Research on post-traumatic growth provides particularly interesting insights. Psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun discovered that people who experience great wounds can actually achieve deeper growth through that experience. The stories of Mary Magdalene and Oprah Winfrey are typical examples of such post-traumatic growth. The biblical record about Mary Magdalene is quite limited. Luke 8 introduces her as Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out, and records that she played a core role in Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection events. But within this simple record lies an amazing story of transformation. There are various interpretations of what 7 demons specifically means. It's interpreted as mental illness, moral corruption, spiritual oppression, etc. But what's important is not the specific content, but the fact that she was in an extremely desperate situation. Sociologist Irving Goffman analyzed the experiences of people excluded and discriminated against in society through stigma theory. Mary Magdalene at that time would have been exactly such a stigmatized being, pushed to society's margins for being a woman and for suffering mental illness. But after meeting Jesus, her life completely changed. She was no longer a being abandoned by society, but became someone playing an important role in Jesus' disciples. Actually, in all 4 Gospels, Mary Magdalene's name appears first whenever Jesus' female disciples are mentioned. This means she was in a leadership position among the female disciples. More surprising is her role in the resurrection event. According to John 20, Mary Magdalene was the first person to meet the resurrected Jesus. And she received a direct command from Jesus to tell the other disciples the news of resurrection. This is why she's called Apostle to the Apostles. This was revolutionary in the social context of that time. Women's testimony wasn't accepted in Jewish courts, but God entrusted the most important news, the testimony of resurrection, to a woman, and moreover to a woman who had been extremely desperate in the past. Psychologist Viktor Frankl said through logotherapy that suffering itself has no meaning, but our attitude towards suffering can create meaning. Mary Magdalene's past suffering became the qualification to more deeply understand and convey the joy of resurrection. Now let's move to Oprah Winfrey's story. Born in 1954 into a poor Mississippi family, her childhood was truly miserable. She grew up under an unmarried mother and was sexually abused by relatives from age 9 to 14. She became pregnant at 14, but the baby soon died. She spent her adolescence marked by drug abuse, running away, and delinquency. That a girl with such background became one of the world's most influential media figures is truly amazing. But more important is how she transformed her wounds into tools for healing others. The Oprah Winfrey Show went beyond a simple talk show to serve as a platform for healing and reconciliation in American society. While addressing society's dark aspects like racial discrimination, sexual violence, domestic violence, and addiction, it conveyed messages of hope rather than despair. From Pierre Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital, Oprah converted her painful experiences into a unique form of cultural capital. Those experiences gave her special ability to understand and empathize with others' pain. The commonalities between Mary Magdalene and Oprah Winfrey include: first, both started from the very bottom of society. Mary Magdalene lived as a demon-possessed woman. Oprah as a poor, abused black girl. Second, both experienced transformation through decisive encounters. Mary Magdalene met Jesus. Oprah discovered a new world through books and education. Third, both didn't stop at their own transformation, but devoted themselves to others' transformation. Mary Magdalene became a witness to resurrection. Oprah conveyed messages of hope through media. But there's also a point we should think about critically. Can everyone really experience such dramatic transformation? Don't such success stories perhaps place another burden on suffering people? Actually, one criticism of positive psychology is the violence of positive thinking. Forcing suffering people to think positively, or make this an opportunity for growth, can make wounds even deeper. This criticism is quite valid. Generalizing Mary Magdalene's or Oprah's cases to expect the same transformation from everyone is dangerous, because each person's situation, abilities, and resources are different. But nevertheless, the hope these stories give cannot be ignored. What's important is understanding how transformation occurred. In Mary Magdalene's case, the core of transformation was her encounter with Jesus. She didn't change through her own willpower or effort alone. She experienced God's grace and love, which fundamentally changed her identity. Oprah's case is similar. She often emphasizes the importance of gratitude. She says, acknowledging the grace and help she received and sharing it with others is true success. According to neuroscientist Rick Hanson's research, focusing on gratitude and positive experiences actually changes brain structure. New neural connections are made, and response patterns to negative emotions change. But this also isn't accomplished through individual effort alone. Appropriate support systems, safe environments, healing relationships must be provided. Mary Magdalene had Jesus and the disciple community. Oprah had mentors and educational opportunities. Another important point is the matter of time. Change doesn't happen overnight. Mary Magdalene didn't become perfect immediately after meeting Jesus. She despaired at the cross and wept at the tomb. But through that process, she learned deeper faith and love. Oprah is the same. Looking at her autobiographical content, she had to continue wrestling with her wounds even after success. Complete healing was a lifelong task. This teaches us an important lesson. Change and healing are not destinations but journeys. Everything isn't solved through one dramatic experience, but accomplished through new choices and decisions every day. So, how can we experience such transformation? First, don't deny your wounds. Like Mary Magdalene and Oprah, honestly acknowledging your pain is the first step of healing. Second, don't try to solve everything alone. You must receive help from trustworthy people and professionals. Third, share the healing you've received with others. Healing deepens more when helping others than when remaining a personal experience. Fourth, don't expect perfection. You must accept that change is a gradual and continuous process. What wounds or despair are you in now? Are you perhaps giving up thinking, I can never change? The stories of Mary Magdalene and Oprah Winfrey tell us this. No darkness is eternal, and before God's grace and love, everything can be made new. Chapter 7. Sarah and Modern Women of Faith. Faith that makes the impossible possible. Philosophical exploration of faith continues from Kierkegaard's Leap of Faith to modern philosophy of religion. William James particularly defined faith as an act of will in The Varieties of Religious Experience. Choosing to believe what cannot be proven is faith. Sarah's story is a typical example of such volitional faith. Let's look specifically at Sarah's situation. In Genesis 18, when angels told Abraham, Sarah will give birth to a son this time next year, Sarah was 89 years old. Physiologically, pregnancy was impossible at that age. Moreover, she was a woman who had suffered from infertility all her life. Sarah's first reaction was laughter. In Hebrew, tzahak, which wasn't mocking laughter, but laughter of incredulity. It meant she was coldly assessing the situation. But Hebrews 11:11 includes Sarah in the chapter of faith, recording, By faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. In other words, though she laughed at first, she ultimately chose faith. From a cognitive psychology perspective, Sarah would have experienced cognitive dissonance. This concept presented by Leon Festinger refers to discomfort felt between conflicting cognitions. In Sarah's case, it was conflict between the reality recognition, I am too old, and the belief, God has promised. Most people resolve such cognitive dissonance by choosing the easier side. Sarah, too, could have accepted reality and doubted God's promise. But she chose the difficult path, deciding to believe God's promise over reality. This wasn't simple positive thinking. Sarah fully acknowledged her limitations, but simultaneously, she believed God's power was greater than her limitations. The expression, she judged him faithful who had promised, is key. It was faith in God's faithfulness. Now let's move to stories of modern women of faith. In politics, society, education, medicine, and other fields, there are women who accomplished seemingly impossible things through faith's power. For example, Mother Teresa served in Calcutta's slums for 50 years and became a globally respected figure. When she first arrived in Calcutta, she had nothing, no money, organization, or supporters. But starting with just the faith that God has called me, she eventually became a saint who received the Nobel Peace Prize. In our country, actresses like Yoon Yoo-jung or Kim Hae-soo can be seen in similar contexts. Though they gained international fame in later years, they had been walking their path steadily since their youth. Even when the Korean film industry was barren, they didn't give up and maintained their faith in acting. In education, there's Scranton, who established Ewha Women's University, and in modern times, female educators working to resolve educational inequality. They all devoted their lives with the faith that the world can be changed through education. In medicine, from Florence Nightingale, called the Mother of Nursing, to current female medical staff, there are women devoted to saving lives. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic, many female medical workers cared for patients despite danger. What commonalities do these modern women of faith share with Sarah? First, while acknowledging reality's limitations, they believed in greater possibilities. Just as Sarah acknowledged her age while believing God's promise, modern women of faith don't deny realistic difficulties, but embrace greater visions. Second, they have long-term perspectives. Sarah waited 25 years. Modern women of faith also don't obsess over short-term results, but handle their work as lifelong callings. Third, they have purposes beyond personal achievement. Sarah's son Isaac wasn't simply fulfilling her personal wish, but part of God's salvation plan. Modern women of faith also devote themselves to greater good rather than their own success. But there's a point to think about carefully. Are all faiths ultimately rewarded? How should we understand cases that don't receive miraculous answers like Sarah? Actually, there are many people who prayed with faith but weren't healed. Missionaries who devoted themselves on mission fields but were martyred. People who fought for social justice but passed away without seeing change. How can we explain this reality? Philosopher John Hick tried to answer this problem through soul-making theory. Suffering and trials are processes to make humans into more mature spiritual beings. Sarah's 25 years of waiting can also be understood from this perspective. But such explanation alone is insufficient. From a biblical perspective, faith's value doesn't lie only in results. Faith itself is a precious experience that deepens relationship with God and helps discover life's meaning. Looking at Sarah's case again, the 25 years of waiting before Isaac's birth weren't wasted time. Through that time, her faith in God deepened, her relationship with Abraham matured. Above all, she learned trust in God's timing and methods. Modern women of faith are the same. Even if they don't immediately achieve visible results, their faith isn't in vain. Through faith, they discover deeper life meaning, give hope to others, and leave precious legacies for future generations. So how can we have faith like Sarah's? First, accurately assess reality. Like Sarah, honestly acknowledging your limitations is faith's starting point. Blind optimism isn't true faith. Second, focus on God's faithfulness. Like Sarah, who judged him faithful who had promised, conviction about God's character and promises is important. Third, recognize waiting's value. Rather than expecting immediate answers, patience to wait for God's timing is needed. Fourth, cherish the process. Not only results are important, but the process of living by faith itself has great meaning. Fifth, share faith with community. Sarah had Abraham, and modern women of faith have faith communities. What are you believing now? Do you perhaps have dreams or visions you want to give up because reality's walls seem too high? The stories of Sarah and modern women of faith tell us this. True faith doesn't make the impossible possible, but gives courage to walk with God, even in seemingly impossible situations. Epilogue. Women's spirituality that transcends time. French historian Fernand Braudel explained history in 3 layers. The rapidly changing history of events, the medium-paced history of social structures, and the deep layer of human spirit that barely changes. The stories of women we've encountered show humanity's universal experiences repeated in this deep layer. From Deborah and Angela Merkel, we learned that true leadership comes not from abuse of power, but from service and wisdom. Through Esther and Malala Yousafzai, we discovered the source of power to show courage even in desperate situations. From Ruth and Comfort Women survivors' stories, we realized how wounds can be transformed into tools of healing. Through Mary and Kate Middleton, we rediscovered the true meaning of obedience, not blind compliance, but voluntary devotion to greater purpose. From Hannah and Praying Mothers, we learned that prayer is not simple wish-making, but deep communion with God. Mary Magdalene and Oprah Winfrey's stories gave us hope that no desperate past can prevent a new future. Through Sarah and modern women of faith, we saw faith's power to trust God, even in seemingly impossible situations. What common theme runs through all these stories? First, God-centered life. They all didn't place themselves at the center. They prioritized God's will and community benefit over personal achievement or happiness. This was the decisive factor that made them figures who changed history from ordinary people. Second, harmony between reality recognition and transcendent hope. They all accurately grasped reality. They didn't deny their limitations or situations' difficulties, but they also didn't surrender to reality. They transcended reality through conviction about God's power and promises. Third, ability to sublimate personal pain into community benefit. They didn't end their difficulties or wounds in personal resentment. Rather, through those experiences, they gained wisdom and ability to understand and help others. Fourth, spiritual discernment to read the times. They all accurately grasped their era's spiritual state and could discern what God wanted in that time, and they responded to that calling. Fifth, responsibility for future generations. Their choices and actions weren't just for their present. They always hoped future generations could live in a better world. So what can we learn from their stories as we live in modern times? First, we must break free from stereotypes about roles and gender. Biblical women transcended the roles their contemporary society expected of women. Modern excellent women are the same. God calls people to fulfill his purposes regardless of gender or social status. Second, we must acknowledge the importance of small faithfulness. Many of them didn't start with grand works. They were faithful in small tasks given to them, which eventually led to great things. Even if our current work seems small and insignificant, it can have precious meaning from God's perspective. Third, we must restore community consciousness. Modern society's strong individualism makes it easy to focus only on our own success and happiness. But these stories show that true meaning and satisfaction come from devotion to community. Fourth, we must accept difficulties as opportunities for growth. They all went through difficult situations, but those difficulties made them more mature and wise people. We too should think about how God is shaping us through current difficulties, rather than resenting them. Fifth, we must deepen communion with God through prayer and the Word. Their source of strength was deep relationship with God. Not formal religious acts, but personal encounters with the living God transformed their lives. But there's one thing we must be careful about. We shouldn't accept these stories only as success stories. Not everyone can achieve the same results as them. What's important is not the result, but the process. Living in obedience to God's will is itself a meaningful life. Also, we shouldn't limit these stories to apply only to women. Though women's unique perspectives and experiences are important, the spiritual principles they showed apply to all Christians transcending gender. Finally, these stories shouldn't remain as heroic tales of the past. God is continuing his history through you and me even now. Each of us can become the Deborah, Esther, or Mary of our time. Looking back at history, what changed the world wasn't a few heroes, but ordinary people who did their best in their positions. The great women of the Bible were also ordinary people at first, but when they responded to God's calling, they became figures who changed history. You too may seem ordinary now. You might think you lack special abilities or conditions. But God is one who does extraordinary things through ordinary people. What's important is not ability or conditions, but obedience to God's will. Dear friends, I hope the stories we've shared today don't end as mere knowledge. I hope they lead to actual change and challenge in your lives. Like the great women of the Bible and excellent women of modern times, I hope you too become precious instruments used by God's hand. I hope your life becomes a beautiful story that gives hope and courage to others. And when we stand before God someday, I hope we can hear the praise. Well done, good and faithful servant. May God's grace be with you. Thank you.